weeks ago, we took Ella to interview at a program that we're looking at kind of in the future of things that she could be a part of. And so the person who is in charge of the program has a child, an adult child with Down syndrome. And one thing that person said is, parents, you have to come to this understanding right now. If your child comes here, things will go wrong. And if you can't accept that, this is not going to be the place for you. I felt like that was the best wedding advice I've ever heard in my life. That what I need to start saying to a couple as I stand here is, listen, I can guarantee you this, if you go forward with this, things will go wrong. And if you can't accept that, you shouldn't say I do at this moment. Whenever we talk about the skill of reconnection, it is important and vital that we find patterns and ways to reconnect just through the busyness of life. Because if we don't do that, then literally our love is going to erode away. And that's how you end up living parallel lives. It puts you in tremendous danger now for some very bad coping mechanisms. Basically, as you start living parallel lives, your hearts are going to die. And eventually someone or something is going to come along that makes your heart feel again. And you will be tempted in that moment to express that feeling in inappropriate ways. I can't underestimate the importance of having patterns of reconnection in everyday life. At the same time, conflict does provide a unique kind of specific rupture that happens in relationships. And the mistake that we make is that we assume if couples are healthy that they have less of those, when all the research shows us that that is not true. The secret sauce now of healthy couples is not the absence of conflict. It is actually the ability to repair. And so the phrase that has become famous in the psychological world that many people use is this skill would actually be defined as rupture and repair. That every relationship has ruptures. There are things that cause us now to disconnect from one another. The skill that needs to be learned is how can we quickly reconnect instead of getting in these unhealthy patterns in which it can take hours, days, weeks in which this disconnection happens until finally we get so tired of the disconnection that we just reunite without ever actually dealing with the issue. How can we get skilled enough now to look at issues in a proper way, not to take them so personally, to be able to navigate this appropriately so that whenever the ruptures happen, it's not just the ability that we need to reconnect. It's actually now an opportunity to not only reconnect, but to actually build trust and respect with one another. This is something that I don't think many people understand, that healthy couples have an ability to take negative circumstances and that actually improves their relationship as they love each other well in the midst of the disagreement and as they learn to reconnect with each other. And so it's actually possible now, the very situations and circumstances that could cause an unhealthy couple to divorce, a healthy couple could go through the exact same situation. And the byproduct of that situation is they actually end up loving each other better. Because let's face it, there are few better ways to earn your spouse's trust and respect and to show vulnerability than to handle a mistake well. And so let's use a picture of addiction. Let's say you have a recovering addict who has now learned the skills and understands what they need to happen. And let's say they make a mistake and they take a drink in that moment. They don't want to, but they slip into an old behavior. And in the old behavior, then, even if they've been sober for a long time, in the old behavior, they would hide that. And then the next day just go about as though it hadn't happened. And that's actually the first step now to relapse. But in a healthy, recovering way, they have that drink, they recognize it, they call their sponsor. And then they work the steps again, and that one mistake might be minimized, the consequences in their lives. That is actually a sign of health. A sign of health in a relationship is the ability now, whenever we do handle things wrong and we say the wrong thing and we let disconnection go too long and maybe we provoke it in that moment, is to then learn the skills to apologize, to own it, to reconnect. And what happens there is the very things that used to drag us down and separate us can actually become things that push us forward and make us connect at a deeper level. That's the opportunity that is actually before you. So when conflict creates a feeling of disconnection, we must learn how to repair the relationship, not necessarily solve the issue. And this is what I was talking about in the previous session of we do A so we get to do B. We're going to deal with the issue, no doubt, but the issue isn't really the issue. The issue now is just what's happening at the surface. The relationship is the actual thing that we're going to focus in on. Now remember what Gottman says whenever it comes to conflict within a marriage, within a relationship. He's going to say that conflict now falls into two categories. There are some things now that are solvable, and there's other problems that are perpetual. And the problem is we tend to think all problems are solvable, and then whenever we enter into the conflict, we're trying to win the argument, and a good amount of the time, we're now trying to win an argument that actually can't be won. And so the truth of the matter is here, and Miranda, the slide's going to be wrong because I noticed my stat here is wrong, so my apologies to you. Only 30% of problems are actually solvable. 70% are perpetual. So it's the reverse of what the slide says. The slide is solvable. My making mistakes, perpetual. So 30% are solvable, 70% are perpetual. So think about this. What makes an issue solvable versus perpetual? It tends to be this. A solvable problem is either an actual right or wrong, but more likely what's going on is it's situational. Who's going to pick up the kids from school today? That's a solvable problem. Well, I'm at work. What's the legal age to Uber a kid? I don't know. All right, you're going to have to figure that out. And so you have to have negotiation skills. And that's actually a topic that we might talk about if y'all vote about it later this week of what we're going to cover in these next few is negotiation, I think, is a marital skill. So we're going to have to negotiate this out in a way that we both feel seen, heard, and valued, and we sacrifice at different levels. It's situational. Okay, a perpetual problem most of the time is there's not a specific right or wrong. The disagreement is actually sourced in different perspectives. So Jenny grew up rural Oklahoma, hardworking, right? Everything that you think that's good about rural Oklahoma, that's where Jenny grew up. I just a hardy work ethic, all these kind of things, right? I grew up in the suburbs. I know you don't think that Arkansas has them. They do, right? It's hilarious to me. I'm seen as a city boy, right? Whenever I go home, right? And so we approach life from these different values. You've heard me tell the story before that our very first Saturday at home after her honeymoon, that Jenny comes in and wakes me up and says, "How long are you going to sleep?" And I'm like, "Well, apparently till right now." And I said, "Well, my plan was to sleep, however long I sleep and then wake up and watch golf." And she's like, "We got things to do. It's Saturday." And I'm like, "I know it's Saturday. We don't have to do anything." And so in my world, Saturday was the one day you had, if it wasn't a sports season that you were playing in, it was the one day you had not to do anything. Because Sunday was church and all those responsibilities. In her family, you were working all week at your job. Saturday was the only day you had to get all the work around the house to do. And so the kids did not sleep in. They woke up. In my house, the kids slept in. In her house, they didn't. Our first Saturday of marriage. And she's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "What are you doing?" Now, that's just different perspectives. That's not a right or wrong. Now, she's back there thinking that's a right and wrong. It's not a right or wrong. That's just different perspectives. And when you and I begin to try to handle conflict with a perpetual problem that is just different perspectives, and we're trying to win the argument, we have now set ourselves up for a guaranteed failure that's just going to rip us further apart. And what needs to happen in a perpetual problem is you have to negotiate a settled resolution in that moment, but you know this discussion is going to come back up a year from now or 6 months from now or a couple weeks from now. These are just perpetual problems that aren't right or wrong. They're issues that might be unique to us, may not be unique to us. Now let's begin to navigate them. But in both scenarios, here's the danger that we fall into. We think to ourselves, if we can convince our spouse that we are right and that they are wrong, we will feel reconnected. You won't. And what is the primary issue, the relationship, isn't even thought of. And we get distracted by the issue. And the issue ends up killing us. And so you ask the average person that's divorced, what was the cause of your divorce? And they will say, money, conflict, family, communication, extended family, parenting. It's none of those things. That's just the presenting issue of what was going on underneath that they might not have ever seen. So notice what the issue is. It's disconnection, not disagreement. Have you ever noticed that there are times in which you can disagree with your spouse and it's not any big deal at all? And then there are other times in which you can disagree over the exact same issue and it feels major, it feels significant? It's because the issue is not disagreement. We disagree with our friends all the time, but we don't feel disconnected from them. And so we got to focus in on the idea of the disconnection. So we see, I'm going to say it the same way in a different way. Seek to fix the problem rather than being distracted by the issue. So what that means is we want to get the enemy right. And the enemy is the issue or the pattern and not each other. So here's what happens to the average couple. I'm here. She's here. There's an issue that is between us. And I start pointing at her, and she starts pointing at me, and before long, we may not even remember what we're fighting about. The issue is pushed to the side, and now it's her against me. And the fight's on. Now, here's the problem with this scenario. Even if I win, she's lost. Or if she wins, I've lost. And now, once we engage in this moment, and this can be the idea of here's what you did wrong. This can be the idea of he said, she said. It can be the idea of, well, here's what your actual intent was, and you're not feeling that, and all those things. What's happening in that moment is the moment it is no longer about the issue, and it's me versus her. The value of one of us, likely the value of both of us, is going to shrink. There's going to be disrespect. There's going to be distrust. We're going to put up walls. We're not going to be vulnerable in any way. We're going to feel extremely isolated from the very person that we're supposed to feel most connected with. And at this moment, we have no chance. And so the skill, whenever it comes to this, is to bring the issue back out and then to get on the same side and to say, that's the problem. We're united. We're together. We might disagree on how we're going to figure it out, and we got to figure out, is it solvable or is it perpetual or what does all that look like? But I am by your side. You were with me. We're going to fixate first and foremost on this idea that we're connected, that we're united. Then we're going to enter into a debate with the actual issue. We're going to try to attack the actual problem. But if we find that we're turning toward one another, we're going to step back out of it. We're going to reconnect. Then we're going to step back into it and figure it out. But the whole time, it is us versus that. And if you can learn that skill, conflict will never destroy you. There is nobody that shows up at divorce court on the same side saying, that's the issue, Your Honor. They're divided. And you and I have to continually remind ourselves of what the issue is, who the enemy is. And notice, it's an issue, but then over time, it's actually a pattern. And so one of the things I want you to do, and there's tons of resources online for you to do this. I don't have to lead you through this exercise. We can look at it in later sessions if you want. But But one of the things I want you to do, I want you to become an expert on your conflict patterns. What does conflict look like for you? And a lot of that's going to have to do with attachment style. It's going to have to do with your temperaments, your personalities, where the health of your relationship is. So Sue Johnson, in her book Hold Me Tight, if you've never read it, I would highly recommend you reading it. I don't know if Sue's a Christian or not. It's not written from that perspective, so don't hold me accountable to any heresy that might be in it. That's between you and God. But the marriage stuff is good, and I think there are biblical principles underneath it. If you can't necessarily navigate it that way, there's a book called Created for Connection that she wrote with the pastor that takes all the heresy out, if there is any. But this idea, she says basically there's only 3 types of fights. That you can narrow everything down into 3 basic types of fights, and they're find the bad guy, what she calls the polka protest, and then freeze and flee. Now, every couple could have all 3 types, but then certain personality types are going to be more prone to others. So if you have a more anxious attachment and your partner has a more anxious attachment, you're a little bit more likely into this find the bad guy. I think we're all more likely into this find the bad guy, especially if you've had a sibling, because this is every fight you ever have with your sibling. And find the bad guy is this: conflict has happened. We have to find somebody who has done wrong and we can blame. And the only 2 choices are me or my spouse. And so obviously it's not me, so it must be her. So now we're going to go through the whole history of what was said and what was done and what was actually intended. And we're actually going to get this long debate of what was actually said, because neither one of us can really remember what was actually said. And then we're going to go back to what you said earlier and she said now and he said then. And then if that's not working, we will actually begin to gunny sack from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago. If we need more ammunition, if I need to prove you're a bad person, I have a long list of things that I remember until eventually I can wear you down to show that you are the guilty party. I have won. Now let's reconnect. And it does not take rocket science for you to figure out that you're playing find the bad guy. And what if you learned the skill? And what if you came up with a code word of some sort in which you just said, hey, let's recognize what's going on right here? What if you had the ability in the middle of that you recognize you're actually trying to blame your spouse for what is going down, and now instead of being with the issue together against it, you're actually attacking each other? What if mid-fight you just looked at her and said, did you hear Kevin Thompson escape from prison? And it just brought you back to this moment in which you can then say, and I think we're trying to find the bad guy here. Let's step back. How can we reconnect? I love you. I'm for you. Hey, is this solvable or not? If it's not, it doesn't mean we ignore it. It means we begin to recognize and begin to ask the question, okay, if it's a perpetual kind of problem and not solvable, hey, what's your perspective here? Tell me about it. Tell me about what you see here. And I'm not going to debate it. I'm going to say, all right, that's what you see in this moment. And then I'm going to say, here's how I see it. All right, how can you influence me? How can I influence you? But we don't have to be doing detective work to try to figure out who's wrong. That's what I did whenever I was 8 with my sister. I don't want to do that with my wife. And then you have what's considered the polka protest. Maybe you've heard it as pursue and withdraw. This is a very classic thing if you have a relationship where you have some pathways in which one has a more anxious attachment, one has a more avoidant attachment. So if you're not familiar with those terms, don't forget anxious attachment kind of means I need intimacy with the other person in order to be a person. And the avoidant attachment is I need distance from intimacy because too much intimacy will actually take away my own identity. And so then what happens is I am, as an anxiously attached person, I'm going to actually read too much into life circumstances. And if I get any sense that you're kind of leaning away from me, that is a danger now to my own personhood. And as I said earlier, that attachment behavioral system will kick into high gear whenever it feels like you're distancing yourself anyway whatsoever from me. And so without me even knowing, my heart rate's going to begin to rise. My body's going to feel with the stress hormone. Negative thoughts are going to enter in, and then finally whenever it actually becomes conscious, I'm going to be trying to second guess what's going on there, and as they're leaning away, I will panic, and that will cause me to want to draw them toward me. But if you have an avoidant attachment, then whenever somebody kind of comes at you with too much force, you're going to want to run the other way. And so now you start to run the other way, which causes me to panic even more, which causes me to chase even harder, which scares you to cause you to run even more. And now we're on this idea of I'm pursuing and we're withdrawing and we're getting miles apart. Until finally we get so sick of running that finally we kind of just collapse into each other. We tend not to deal with the issue. We tend not to make amends. We tend not to apologize. We tend not to own what has actually happened. Instead, we're just tired of the disconnection so that we reconnect. And in that moment, as an anxious partner, I think to myself, finally, we have had a breakthrough. This is what life is going to forever be like. While the avoidant partner thinks to himself, finally, we had a breakthrough. I'll never have to connect like that again. And now the next fight is already set up. And it's just going to take some time until I either rightly read a little bit of distance or even wrongly read a little bit of distance. And the avoidant looks and either rightly or wrongly feels like they're coming for emotional intimacy more than I want to, and now I'm running and now they're chasing. And to be able to step back and go, okay, stop. What's the pattern here? Let's back off of that. And how can we now engage in a healthy way? And a lot of times what that means is for the anxious person now to learn to regulate themselves and not chase. And they go, you know what, they need space right now. That's okay, let's give them some space. And then for the avoidant person to say, okay, stop, let me self-regulate. I actually don't need as much space as I feel like I do. Let me lean into connection and intimacy. I was talking just this week with a couple who, after several decades of marriage, have actually begun to figure this pattern out. And the person was telling me about a recent situation that in years past has always caused this hurt and this brokenness and this almost week-long pattern in which disconnection takes place. And what happened now, this person now anxious, recognizes the avoidance within his spouse, and he chose not to chase, and he gave space. She took the space but recognized what was happening and leaned into the intimacy. And what used to take a week to figure out literally was solved in an afternoon because they've learned the pattern. They've owned their own part of that, and now they're choosing different ways while at the same time respecting what the other person needs. And it changes the nature of conflict. And then if you're both avoidant, then neither one of you really want to deal with emotional stuff or deal with intimacy in any way whatsoever. And so whenever conflict arises, you just kind of freeze and kind of walk away and hope that it all calms over. And so many times if you have two spouses who are both either workaholics, or if you have one spouse who is a workaholic and the other spouse stays home and yet home life is extremely busy, conflict happens, they don't deal with it, they get engrossed in what their responsibilities are, they distance from each other, from themselves, and then eventually they kind of come back, but they've never actually dealt with anything. And in no way does that cause any type of connection. So you need to recognize those three types of fights within your own relationship. If you want more information with that, hold me tight, Sue Johnson. There's tons of videos online. Sue has videos that are online. Just begin to learn what the patterns are and then find a way to recognize. And it begins by you recognizing first and foremost after it happened. Then you go, oh, that's what we just did. And then you get to a point where you can actually recognize in the middle of what's happening. And then if you keep on doing that, you can actually then begin to recognize before it even happens. Before you start to say, well, you said, and you go, oh, no, I'm reading the court reporter tape back. We only do that when we're trying to find the bad guy. And then you can actually begin to change behavior in some way. So here are two sub-skills I want you to learn in the midst of conflict. One is you need to learn to reach, and the other one is you need to learn to respond. And this cannot be, I pick one, they pick the other for the rest of life. Both of these are skills that both of you need to have. So whenever you feel disconnection, whenever conflict causes disconnection, can you create the skill in which you can reach for your spouse? to show now I'm empty-handed, right? What's the handshake is so powerful? It's to show that I don't have a gun on me at this moment. That's why it was supposed to happen back in the day. Now, if you're in Arkansas, if the shirt's untucked, they have a gun on them. But I don't care if they're shaking your hand or not. But it's this idea of I'm unarmed. Can you now show your spouse, hey, I'm unarmed. I want connection with you. I'm not going to throw stones. I'm not going to use my tongue now to lash out at you. I want connection. Let's reestablish connection. I trust you. I love you. I'm for you. I'm going to be vulnerable here. And even though I don't feel connected, I'm going to reach out for the very thing that we actually both want. And so we can do that with kind of having a self-focus to some extent. So find the bad guy is you did this, you did that. Let me recount all that. Instead, to reach out, I might begin to say, hey, here's what I've done. Here's what I wanted. These are all the classic I statements that you learned in freshman communication class, in which you're starting with me. And at the same time, you're also encouraging the other person of what are the positive traits that you know they have. I know you would never mean for me to feel this way. But when this happened, I felt like I couldn't trust you in this moment. I felt disconnected. And I don't want that. I know you don't want that either. And what you're doing now is you're coming with a peace offering, not downplaying or over minimizing the situation, but trying to now reconnect in some way. It means now you come with an invitation rather than an accusation. I want to invite you back into connection instead of accusing you into being the bad guy of what's going on. It means you fixate on the actual issue, not on trying to define the person by it. So it's okay for me to say, I don't like what happened here, but notice how that's a singular situation and event, as opposed to, well, you always, well, now that's the whole person. What chance do they have in that moment? So you have to learn now to reach, and sometimes literally, all it is a physical reach. Who's going to make the first move? There's disconnection. You know you're going to reconnect. Who's going to make the first move? Figure out a way to make the first move. But then you also need to learn how to respond. So if they reach out for a reach of connection, not a reach of sex, but if they reach out for a reach of connection and you slap their hand away, well, that's dejecting to them. Now, there are times that hands need to be slapped away. If the affair has just been revealed and they reach out, slap it. No, not right now. But if it's just kind of a normal thing and you feel things got a little heated you didn't mean for it to, or there's just a coldness and they reach out, you got to respond. You got to reach back. And now you're going to come from, all right, here's the perspective in humility and vulnerability and openness and inquisitiveness. And one thing that will save all of us in the midst of conflict is to find a way toward curiosity. All right, what is your perspective here? How do you see this? Could I be wrong? Did I do wrong? Did what I say I intended one way and you took it, not just that you took it another way, it's that you felt the opposite of the very thing that I intended. How can I change my behavior now to have that kind of humble openness of what's going on? You got to learn how to respond. And if you get into a pattern in which it's always her reaching out and him responding, or him reaching out and her responding, and it's always that pattern, that's unhealthy. Both of you need to learn both of those skills to where you are both trying to now resolve the conflict that has taken place. So let's close here. Text in your questions. We're not going to have a lot of time for them, but text them into 56316, marriage to 56316. Now let's just look at a couple of kind of these pseudo repairs that I want you to be aware of whenever it comes to fighting, conflict. Some people just pretend it never happened. Like, we're just going to pretend that never happened. And what that is that's avoidance. Instead of actually dealing with the issue, we're going to sweep it under the rug. And the problem with that is that gets built up. And while it might on the surface look like there's a piece that is there, it's a pseudo piece, because I assure you one of you or both of you are going to remember. And the damage that was done, it would be the equivalent now of me getting a serious cut, not doing stitches, not taking antibiotics, and then just going, oh, well, it's not bleeding anymore, everything's fine, not realizing in 2 weeks an infection is going to break out and I might die from it. And that's what happens whenever we avoid things that are happening. Apologizing but not meaning it. Your spouse can feel that. We got to be very careful about passive apologies. Of just saying I'm sorry and there not being any substance there. If you have an anxious attachment, you probably apologize too quickly. If you have an avoidant attachment, an apology is when you say, I'm sorry. You actually own. That's funnier than y'all gave that credit for. Avoidant attachment doesn't actually deal with emotions enough oftentimes to apologize. That's a psychological joke. Look it up. Okay, that's hilarious. That didn't work at all. I'm so glad my coworkers aren't here to see that. We should apologize, no doubt, but you should not apologize unless you actually mean it. It shows an ownership of something. Finding connections in other places and people. So when you and your spouse have high conflict, your body is highly responding to that, and instead of resolving it with each other, you go find another outlet. So you just constantly then go to work, calm yourself, and then come back. The danger in that is you're training your brain not to turn toward your spouse. Distraction by another issue. A lot of couples will simply have an issue at play, and eventually something else will happen. They'll turn to that, and they never actually resolve anything that's taken place. And then finally, aggressive or avoidant agreement. Aggressive agreement is basically you make yourself so big, you scare the other person into agreeing with you. That's a pseudo peace. Or you're so avoidant toward conflict that you quickly cave and agree even though you don't necessarily mean it. And my guess is in most relationships, there's some dynamic of this that is going on. There is one of you that is probably a little bit, maybe more anxiously attached. And so you're so scared about the relationship going wrong, you'll cave and you don't really mean it. Or you're so afraid about what conflict is doing, you'll cave because you don't want to deal with it. That over time is going to lead you to a bad place. But if you can begin to figure out how to recognize your patterns, how to stay on the same team, how to keep the issue, the actual issue, the enemy at play, and the idea of connection is more important than anything else, you can actually turn conflict into a gift rather than it being a great danger to your relationship.